Continuing on with our timeline Cold War notes, we're starting to see more and more involvement with countries that are closer to us, such as Chile and other South and Central American countries, as we previously discussed in our group projects. And this goes back to the whole idea of the domino theory. We can also see this in Middle Eastern countries as well. There's a short war referred to as the Yom Kippur War. I'd like for you guys to look at the videos that are on my webpage that deal with that. And what we have here is Israel trying to expand their borders, and the countries surrounding them, Muslim countries surrounding them, Egypt and Syria, they're fighting back. So we're financing the Israelis. The Russians, on the other hand, are financing the Egyptians. So this war breaks out. Both sides, of course, it's war. They're not happy with each other. And we're trying to mediate. Specifically, Kissinger is trying to mediate this war, and it's referred to as shuttle diplomacy. He's flying around to various capitals in the region and trying to have a ceasefire, and it works. But because of this, there's the OPEC embargo. All the oil-producing nations. OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So these countries withhold oil from us. Because of this, gas prices skyrocket. And people are waiting in really long lines to get their gas. Depending on the last number of your license plate, you can only get gas on certain days. The American people are not happy because of this. It does change the auto industry at this time too. Prior to this, there's the idea of the muscle cars, and after this, we are looking for much more economic cars that took less gas. I don't want to go too in-depth with the Watergate scandal. This was the demise of Richard Nixon's presidency. If you've ever seen the quote, or he says, "I'm not a crook," but there were some entities that helped get him elected. Not really legal what they were doing. Like I said, I don't want to get too in-depth with it, but it's Watergate. So you guys have heard things like Deflategate, Russiagate. There's all kinds of different gates. Anytime there's shady dealings going on, we like to use this as a comparison, the Watergate scandal, to other things that happen in either politics or sports, Deflategate, etc. Because Nixon's stepping down, we have Gerald Ford becoming president. He was the vice president. One of the shortest ever sitting presidents, because it was towards the end of Nixon's tenure of office, the 4 years he was elected to be in office. And then we have Jimmy Carter. So during Gerald Ford, not much is going on. Carter is really not known for his strength as being a president. He feels that we have an inordinate fear of communism, calls for a commitment to human rights. This is what he's known for. Looking at human rights, how we've been treating other countries throughout the world. Puts a halt to the B-1 bomber program, major component of the flexible response. The ability to use BMs, bombers, submarines, whatever we feel is necessary for an appropriate response to whatever threat the Soviets might have upon us. Carter signs a treaty with Panama, giving the canal back to the Panamanians by the year 1999. By doing this, Carter is really showing that we're trying to get away from these imperialistic tendencies that the United States has participated in previously. In December, Carter toasts to the Shah of Iran that he has an island of stability within the Middle East in comparison to the other nations around him, like Israel, Syria, Egypt. And we'll get back to this island of stability, this so-called island of stability, later on through the notes. Going off of these poll results, it shows that many Americans don't agree with what Carter is doing. The rolling back of B-1 bombers, the giving back of the Panama Canal. So his popularity numbers do not look good. Israel has been at war since its founding back in 1948. So for roughly 30 years, we see Israel in a constant state of war. During Carter's presidency, to negotiate a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, referred to as the Camp David Accords. Carter administration continues with the Nixon administration's ability to normalize relationships with the People's Republic of China. Getting back to the Shah of Iran, he flees, and the Ayatollah Khomeini comes back and returns from exile 2 weeks after the Shah flees, after a uprising of the people. Vietnam is beginning to have even more issues. China is looking to make incursions into Vietnam because Vietnam is falling more to the side of the USSR. They go ahead and sign on the Comecon plan, which we discussed previously, very similar to NATO. So this alliance with the Soviets instead of the Chinese China feels like they are being left out of the communist movement. So this peace treaty is finally signed on the White House lawn between Egypt and Israel. We are also giving both sides a hefty sum of money to keep this peace treaty going. Turner and Brezhnev both signed the SALT II arms control agreement, further stopping nuclear proliferation. The Sandinista leaders are given $118 million in aid after they overthrow a military dictator. The Shah flees Iran and comes to the U.S. The Iranian people see this as an absolute outrage, and they seize the U.S. embassy through force. They take over 66 hostages, and they're held for over a year. The Union wants to expand their sphere of influence and get more and more communist countries. Afghanistan is a border country to the Soviet Union in the south, kind of like in the middle of the Soviet Union, but of course to the south. And they invade. When they invade, we want to do anything against what the Soviet Union does, so we back Afghanistan and we send advisors, weapons, in order to help the Afghani people. A section of the Afghani people are also known as the Taliban, which later is not a good thing. Because of the invasion of Afghanistan, Carter asked the Senate to table or to put off the SALT II treaty, recalls our ambassador from Moscow. We boycott the Summer Olympics that is supposed to be that is in Moscow. In April of that year, Carter attempts to rescue the hostages in Iran. It's an absolute failure and really a disgrace. Because of Carter's inability to rescue the hostages, the rollback of Cold War mentality, Ronald Reagan gets elected through pretty much a landslide victory. He wants to go back to this idea of the Cold War and dubs them the evil empire. Keep in mind that Ronald Reagan was an actor, and this is also when Star Wars came out. So, not to make a big deal about Star Wars, but at the same time, this is a part of pop culture. And the way politicians are using certain vocabulary in order to expand their popularity, Ronald Reagan is great for this. A part of Reagan's campaign was to get the hostages released, and as soon as he's sworn into office, those hostages are released from Iran. There is a video on my webpage that deals with the Iranian hostage crisis. Please make sure you watch it. There's a little theme music to this, and this pretty much was on every single night in the United States, giving an update of what was going on with this hostage crisis. Reagan really wants to put the Soviets in a corner, so he talks about updating our missile systems to a Pershing II rocket, which is just really pinpoint accurate. It could take out a bunker, for example, instead of a city. It had lower kiloton yield, but at the same time, you don't need that much of a kiloton yield if you're hitting a target directly with a nuclear weapon. We see some unrest within the nuclear sphere, the Eastern Bloc countries. Remember that buffer zone, Poland being one of them. They have to declare martial law because of all the protests that are going on against communism. Now, Reagan being a Republican, we do see a lot of cuts within the governmental budget, however, not in defense, and it actually goes up during Reagan as well. The chest thumping going on with Reagan. He goes to the British Parliament and predicts the downfall of communism, also known as the USSR. Over 1 million people join peacefully to demonstrate against nuclear weaponry. U.S. Marines go to Lebanon to quash a civil war. This is all in 1982, of course. The Soviet Union accuses the United States of pursuing a policy of adventureness, rudeness, and undisguised egoism. This is kind of the way Reagan is. He threatens that he's going to push this world into a nuclear war. Shortly thereafter, Brezhnev dies and Andropov takes over. In 1983, there's a back and forth of Andropov and Reagan, basically calling each other out. Reagan also proposes the SDI, which stands for Strategic Defense Initiative. Colloquially, this is known as the Star Wars program. What this is supposed to be is we launch a satellite. The satellite shoots laser beams in order to intercept nuclear weapons. A Korean airliner, KAL 007, is downed by a Soviet fighter. It was flying from, I believe, Alaska to Korea. In order to get from Alaska to Korea, you have to kind of go around Soviet airspace, but instead, most likely anyways, the pilot drifted into Soviet airspace, and 61 U.S. citizens were killed during this incident, one of them being a U.S. legislature. There is a possible threat in the island nation of Grenada. Grenada is pretty close to South America, northeast portion of South America. It's an island, of course, so it's up there a little bit. We do have some U.S. medical students who are going to school there. By the way, if you want to become a doctor, there are many Caribbean nations that have medical schools if you don't initially get accepted to a U.S. school. Now, you still have to pass your U.S. boards, so you need to make sure you're able to pass your U.S. boards, even if you go out of the country and actually get your degree in medicine. Back to what we were talking about. So we send some troops down there. We invade. Relatively quickly, we're able to quash the unrest. He goes on to blame that anything evil that is found within the world, we should blame it on the Soviets. It is their fault. We go ahead and deploy the Pershing II missiles to West Germany under Reagan. The USSR breaks off talks in Geneva. Both Reagan and Andropov are dubbed Men of the Year by Time magazine. There's a war going on between Iran and Iraq, and we try to tell the international community, please don't sell them any weapons. This war needs to end. Back to this tit-for-tat nature, the USSR boycotts the LA Olympics, which is kind of interesting because this is the Olympics where we win the most gold medals ever. I wonder why. Going on to the next month in August, Reagan tends to be a bit of a comical guy, and he comes up with this quote. He doesn't realize that the microphone's on, and he says, "My fellow Americans, I am pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes. The Russians didn't like this very much. As far as the Contras are concerned, to save time, please make sure you guys watch the video on my webpage. I want to reiterate that it's very important that you guys watch those videos pertaining to the Iran-Contra affair on the webpage, please. Well, I went ahead and skipped over one of the leaders that was between Andropov and Gorbachev, which is Sharenko. He wasn't there very long. He died in office. So now we're on to Gorbachev. Reagan specifically asked Gorbachev to tear down that wall in Berlin, referring to the Berlin Wall. Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. This allows for on-site monitoring of the destruction of our nuclear arsenal. The Soviets start pulling out of Afghanistan in 1988. The Senate ratifies the INF Treaty, and this is really the first advancement of any nuclear disarmament since the SALT I back in 1972. So getting there. Now, out of office, and we have George H.W. Bush. Gorbachev allows elections, and the Soviet Union